Seeing Hollywood as an arm of the defense industry, especially an arm for armaments, shows us that the film industry had a very similar role to that of arms dealer Friedrich Mandel, Hedy Lamarr's first husband. This link between Hollywood and its literal bombshells can help us answer why Lamar insisted her frequency hopping invention was something new, even though it was already a known and patented principle. In the 1950s, another Hollywood company called Western Arms Corporation, or Winfield Arms, became a front company for the CIA, using a Hollywood cinematographer named Leo Lipa as its frontman. According to an article in Reason magazine, Lipa was sent to Europe with Sam Cummings by the deputy director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, to buy old guns left over from World War II. The cover story was that they were buying the guns as props for war movies, and this makes war movies central to the arms trade. They were vehicles of propaganda to promote their purchase, but they were also a cover industry to hide the long-term, the permanent arms industry in plain sight. And there was a reason that war needed promotion from Hollywood. After World War I, the American public was leaning toward isolationism and didn't want to get involved in another war. Congress passed the Neutrality Act in 1935 reflecting that attitude, but this act also made it illegal for American citizens to sell arms to warring countries. According to Wikipedia, the Nye Committee hearings between 1934 and 1936, and several best-selling books of the time, like H.C. Engelbrecht's The Merchants of Death, supported the conviction of many Americans that the U.S. entry into World War I had been orchestrated by bankers and the arms industry for profit reasons. But the permanent arms industry, as well as the aviation industry, needed this isolationist attitude to change, and Hollywood was the best tool to change it. As well as romanticizing war in movies, newsreels could create war scares that frightened Americans into demanding the country join World War II. The book Merchants of Death noticed the connection between arms and films in 1934. The arms merchants have likewise put the moving pictures into their service. The Barrow Works of Vickers Armstrong have their own moving picture theater where prospective buyers may see exhibitions of tanks, warships, machine guns, etc. in action. These special films of the arm makers are also taken on tour to various nations in order to demonstrate before the very eyes of the purchasing agents what effective killing machines are for sale. Here is a publicity and sales medium which the arms merchants have only begun to exploit. This is exactly what Adam Smith had predicted would happen. In Book 4 of Wealth of Nations, Smith describes what we now call the public-private military partnership as the predictable outcome of commercial nations attempting to pay for their expensive wars. It cannot be very difficult to determine who have been the contrivers of this whole mercantile system. Not the consumers, we may believe, whose interest has been entirely neglected, but the producers, whose interest has been so carefully attended to. And among this latter class, our merchants and manufacturers have been by far the principal architects. In the case of war supply, these merchants and manufacturers evolved into modern-day defense contractors. Unlike the U.S., Germany was ramping up its military technology in the 1930s. The Treaty of Versailles had been an attempt to disarm Germany permanently, as the treaty prohibited Germany from replacing its large artillery. But this attempt backfired because it forced Germany to explore and develop small artillery, like rockets and missiles. Germany did this in partnership with the Soviet Union. According to the War on the Rocks website, While Soviet-German military cooperation between 1922 and 1933 is often forgotten, it had a decisive impact on the origins and outbreak of World War II. Germany rebuilt its shattered military at 4 secret bases hidden in Russia. In exchange, the Reichswehr sent men to teach and train the young Soviet officer corps. However, the most important aspect of Soviet-German cooperation was its technological component. Together, the two states built a network of laboratories, workshops, and testing grounds in which they developed what became the major weapons systems of World War II. When the U.S. government realized what Germany and Russia were doing, it began to gather as much intelligence as possible. And one data-gathering mission involved the Hollywood producer Howard Hughes. In 1938, Howard Hughes circumnavigated the Northern Hemisphere in a Lockheed 14 Super Electra as a publicity stunt for the upcoming 1939 World's Fair in New York City. In the field of hidden history research, we already know the legacy of World's Fairs as vehicles through which the controllers hide what they're doing in plain sight. And the World's Fair was a cover story for the reason this 1938 flight was made. The outward foreign manifest indicates that this plane was named New York World's Fair, but the plane was never featured in any exhibit at the fair. The flight was made a full year before the fair opened, and, according to the website This Day in Aviation, after the flight was completed, the plane was immediately returned to Lockheed and sold to the Royal Canadian Air Force. And although it was publicized as a record-breaking event, the flight didn't break any records at all. In fact, it didn't even qualify as an official circumnavigation. The same website states that the International Organization for Flight Records requires that a circumnavigation cross all meridians in one direction and be at least the length of the Tropic of Cancer. Howard Hughes' around-the-world flight circled the Northern Hemisphere and was at least 8,058 miles short of the required distance, so no official record was set. The reason it was so short of the distance is because the flight path was following the Trans-Siberian Railroad, much farther north than the Tropic of Cancer. This flight was never intended to promote the World's Fair. It was an intelligence-gathering mission for the U.S. military, focused on the foreign development of guided missiles. In fact, the symbol of the flight's cover story, the 1939 World's Fair, was a pair of buildings, the perisphere and trilon, and their shapes seemed to suggest, to me anyway, the evolution from the bullet to the missile. According to Wikipedia, both buildings were subsequently razed and scrapped after the closing of the fair, their materials to be used in World War II armaments. Everything always seems to return to the armaments. It was the hidden Russian bases developing missile technology that Hughes' flight was likely flying over, and the flight crew further substantiates the mission. The navigators were Naval Aviator Lieutenant Harry McLean Connor, who had been on many publicized nonstop flights, and First Lieutenant Thomas Lawson Thurlow of the United States Army Air Corps. The radio engineer was especially interesting. Richard Stoddart, a field engineer at NBC, who would form the Stoddart Radio Aircraft Company in Hollywood 2 years later, in 1940. For the flight, Stoddart's employer, NBC, requested radio assistance from the German broadcasting system, which kept in radio contact with Hughes for 5 hours. NBC, like many of the movie studios, was already doing business in and with Germany. 2 years earlier, NBC had provided the equipment for Berlin to televise the 1936 Olympic Games. In 1937, NBC began broadcasting shortwave programming, including German-language content, through its international division. So this request for radio support was just a part of doing business in Germany. The co-pilot and mechanic on Hughes' flight was Edward Lund, a props man who, according to his daughter Dolores Tippo, welded model airplanes for the Hughes film Hell's Angels. According to the LA Times, Lund's daughter said her father bore a striking resemblance to Hughes, and the billionaire often asked Lund to impersonate him at public appearances during the 1930s. In the 1950s, Lund founded his own airplane parts supply company. According to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection website, surveillance technology was on board the 1938 flight. Newspapers of the day reported that Secret Army Aviation Devices were on board, tracking measurements over foreign territory. Even more than his record speed, Hughes was proud that he proved the capabilities of these new technologies. The devices were most likely intercepting radio signals and mapping the terrain with magnetometers, doing an aeromagnetic survey. And the frequency hopping technology that Hedy Lamarr would patent in 1942 would address the very type of vulnerable radio signals that the secret devices on Hughes' plane were able to intercept. The northern flight path over Siberia, landing in Omsk and Yakutsk, took Hughes and his crew over the ancient land of Tartaria. Siberia's remoteness was the reason both the Russian Gulag prisons and the hidden military bases were built there, and according to the Britannica website, the name Siberia is derived from the Tartar term for sleeping land. In the 1850s, the novelist Dostoevsky was imprisoned in the Russian Gulag in Omsk, and fictionalized his prison experience in a novel called House of the Dead. In the story, he wrote about several Tartar prisoners there. One of them, Ali, is described as an uncorrupted boy with native honesty, suggesting that truth-telling was generally considered an ethnic characteristic of the Tartars. But another, Gazin, was violent and feared by the other prisoners. Like any ethnic group, we can't assign one temperament to all its various individuals, but that doesn't stop the act of stereotyping. And Europeans have stereotyped Tartars as being ruthless and vicious for centuries. Other accounts, however, describe them as excellent traders, highly honest in their business dealings. Harold Lamb, in his 1927 book on Genghis Khan, wrote that a virgin carrying a sack of gold could ride unharmed from one border of the empire to the other. I think the point here is that the Tartars may not have been the stereotypical barbarians we were told they were. Captain John Cochrane, in his 1824 pedestrian journey through Russia and Siberian Tartary, wrote that everything tells me I am leaving the widespread and desolate regions of northern Tartary for the populous, civilized and industrious ones of northern Europe. Yet I did not feel elated at leaving a place where I had been happier than in any other part of the world. The sleeping land that had made him happier than anywhere else was now being surveilled and measured by the military apparatus of the civilization that had always called it Tartarus, meaning hell. The year before Hughes' flight over Tartaria, Hedy Lamarr had shown up in Hollywood. After arriving, she almost immediately met her future husband, Gene Markey, and 2 years later they married. Divorce papers were filed in August of 1940, so a year and a half later. But this short marriage gave Hedy Lamarr something that seems like an important piece of her frequency hopping patent, a connection to the Navy. Gene Markey came from a military family, as his father was an Army colonel, and Gene also served in the Army during World War I. But in 1920 he switched to the Navy, enlisting in the Naval Reserve. Hedy didn't file the patent under her stage name. Instead, she used her legal name, Hedy Keesler Markey, which also identified her as the wife of a lieutenant commander in the Naval Reserve. It was for the Navy that she wrote her patent, and she donated it to the Navy in 1942. But why was her naval officer husband, who would later rise to the rank of Rear Admiral, in Hollywood in the first place? In 1929, Gene Markey had moved to Hollywood as a screenwriter in what feels like a very similar clustering to the military brats planted in Laurel Canyon in the 1960s. There seems to have been a similar wave, this time, of anti-fascist screenwriters descending on Hollywood in the late 1920s, including Markey, Herman Mankiewicz, John Howard Lawson, Dorothy Parker, Joseph Moncure March, Samuel Ornitz, Claudine West, Dudley Nichols, and Dashiell Hammett, and this list is not exhaustive. Some of these anti-fascist screenwriters were communist and part of the Hollywood Ten, but all of them defined their anti-fascism only later on, after Hitler came to power in 1933. Italian fascism, known as corporatism, was mostly ignored by Hollywood, with the exception of Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator of 1940, which was still primarily a film mocking Hitler. What most of these screenwriters had in common was a close connection to military intelligence. Joseph March, a screenwriter for Hell's Angels, was the nephew of General Peyton Conway March, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army during World War I, who restructured the War Department that officially recreated the Military Intelligence Division. As one of these screenwriters, Gene Markey was mostly adapting fluff scripts like Fashions of 1934 for films that seemed to accomplish the same purpose as Hell's Angels: to draw the American middle class into superficial pursuits, moving men away from survival and military skills, and moving women away from the regal Tartar woman and into the role of troublesome bombshell, something Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, was also doing. Just after the breakup of his short marriage to Hedy Lamarr, Markey left Hollywood to serve in World War II. In a 1972 postgraduate thesis on public relations policies of the Navy, Robert Klinkerman writes that on August 31, 1944, Secretary Forrestal created a separate motion picture office, which operated under his control and was not a part of the Office of Public Relations. This agency, designated the Office of Navy Photographic Services, was under the direction of Captain Gene Markey, who had extensive experience in the motion picture industry. It represented the Secretary of the Navy in all motion picture matters pertaining to the Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine Corps, coordinated the planning and production of motion picture combat reports that were required by the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, and served as a liaison office with the Army. Notice that Markey's work was outside the standard PR operations. The Navy Photographic Services was a separate intelligence agency reporting directly to the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal. Markey would later achieve the rank of a Navy Commodore, eventually rising to the position of Rear Admiral. Forrestal himself had only become Under Secretary of the Navy 4 years earlier. Prior to that, he was a partner at Dillon Read, the bank mentioned earlier that had purchased a near-controlling interest in Wiener Bankwaren, the bank run by Hedy Lamarr's father. Following World War II, Forrestal, along with the Secretary of War, pressed President Truman for a peacetime intelligence organization. He was instrumental in creating the Unified Defense and Intelligence Apparatus, codified by the National Security Act of 1947, which established both the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency. Forrestal's input had laid the groundwork for the CIA, and Hedy's ex-husband was one of his right-hand men. What we're seeing in this little map of Hedy Lamarr's world is that it's mostly made up of bankers, members of military intelligence, and arms specialists. Even when we add in Howard Hughes, those three categories don't change. The co-author of Hedy Lamarr's patent was George Antheil, who was both a Freemason and a composer of avant-garde, extremely dissonant music. But he had also worked at the Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia during World War I as an inspector of artillery ammunition. He wrote in his autobiography, Bad Boy of Music, that a pianist's fingers are both his ammunition and his machine guns. Again, adding Antiel to her close circle of connections, those three categories don't change. But Antiel's connections to the arms industry go much deeper than simply inspecting artillery. We're told that Antiel met Hedy Lamarr at a dinner party in 1940, but this is either a cover story or an astoundingly incredible coincidence, because both George and Hedy had married into the Mandel Ammunitions family. For Hedy, the connection was simple. Fritz Mandel was her first husband. For George Antiel, it was less direct. He met his wife, Bosky Marcus, when he was living in Berlin. Bosky's grandmother was Ludwika Markbreiter, and her sister, Irene Markbreiter, was married to Ludwig Mandel, who originally purchased the Hurtenberger Patronenfabrik, the ammunitions factory, in 1887. Ownership of that factory then descended through Sigmund, Alexander, and finally to Fritz Mandel, Hedy Lamarr's first husband. Curiouser and curiouser, isn't it? Two people just happened to meet in 1940 at a dinner party, and within 2 years patent an already patented ammunitions technology, and all the while they had both married into the Mandel Ammunitions family. This is likely why Hedy needed to patent an idea that had already been patented several times before. She was likely sent to Hollywood by the Mandel family with this very patent in mind. Next time, we'll explore why the Mandel family may have wanted this patent in American hands. And we'll follow one more connection on George and Bosky's side of this family tree that leads directly to the author of Traum Novelle, to Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, and to the symbol of the piano that keeps showing up.